The Ottoman Empire had a problem. How do you build an army you can trust when everyone around you wants your throne? Nobles have their own armies. Generals have ambitions. Your own family will kill you for power. So the Ottomans came up with a solution that sounds insane. They built the most elite fighting force in the world out of stolen Christian children, ripped them from their families, converted them to Islam, trained them to kill, and turned them into an army so loyal, so brutal, so effective that they terrified Europe for 3 centuries. If you're into dark history that doesn't make it into textbooks, subscribe to A Disturbed Historian. We're telling the stories they don't want taught. The Janissaries weren't volunteers. They weren't mercenaries. They were the product of a system called devshirme, child conscription. Every few years, Ottoman officials would travel through Christian villages in the Balkans, Greece, Serbia, Bulgaria, Albania. They'd go door to door, evaluating boys between the ages of 8 and 18. They were looking for the strongest, the smartest, the healthiest, and when they found them, they took them. The parents had no choice. Resistance meant death. The empire owned you, owned your children. If your son was selected, he was gone. You'd never see him again. He'd be taken to Constantinople, converted to Islam, given a new name, and trained to serve the Sultan. Your Christian boy would become a Muslim soldier who might one day return to burn your village. The selection process was methodical. Ottoman officials knew what they were looking for. Physical strength, yes, but also intelligence, potential for loyalty. They wanted boys young enough to be molded, but old enough to survive the training. They avoided taking only sons because that would destroy the family's ability to pay taxes. They needed the villages functional, productive, able to provide the next generation of conscripts. The boys who were taken walked to Constantinople in chains, hundreds of miles. Some died on the journey. Disease, exhaustion, despair. The ones who survived arrived at the capital and were sorted. The strongest and smartest went to the palace school to be trained as Janissaries. Others were sent to Turkish families in Anatolia to learn the language and convert to Islam properly. They'd work as farmhands for years, forgetting their old lives, their old religion, their families. The boys destined for the Janissaries entered a brutal training system. They learned Turkish, Arabic, Persian. They studied the Quran. They were converted to Islam, though converted is generous. They were told they were Muslim now, and disagreement wasn't an option. They learned to fight, swords, bows, firearms when those became available, wrestling, hand-to-hand combat. They learned discipline, absolute obedience. They learned that the Sultan was their father now. The core was their family. Everything else was erased. The training lasted years. It was designed to break them down and rebuild them as perfect soldiers. They lived in barracks. They ate together, slept together, fought together. They had no outside connections, no family visits, no letters home. The empire made sure they had nothing except the core. That isolation created loyalty. When everyone you know, everyone you trust, everyone who matters is a Janissary, you don't betray the Janissaries. They weren't allowed to marry, at least not originally. The rule was simple. You belong to the Sultan. Your loyalty cannot be divided. A wife means children. Children mean inheritance. Inheritance means you care about something other than the empire. So Janissaries remained celibate. Their barracks were their home. Their fellow soldiers were their brothers. The Sultan was their father. That was the entire world. The Janissaries were paid well, better than regular soldiers. They received regular salaries from the imperial treasury. When they weren't fighting, they lived in Constantinople. They had privileges, access to the best equipment, the best training. They were the elite, and they knew it. That combination of privilege and isolation made them fiercely protective of their status, and they were terrifyingly effective. The Janissaries were shock troops, disciplined, well-trained, fearless, while European armies were still using feudal levies. Peasants with pitchforks led by nobles who'd barely trained. The Janissaries were professional soldiers. They drilled constantly. They maintained their equipment. They followed orders without question. On the battlefield, that discipline was devastating. They used firearms earlier than most European forces. The Ottomans recognized the power of gunpowder and equipped their Janissaries with muskets and cannons. A line of Janissaries firing in coordinated volleys could tear apart cavalry charges, could break infantry formations. European knights in armor, the pride of Christian armies, were mowed down by boys who'd been stolen from Christian villages and turned into the empire's finest killers. The Janissaries spearheaded Ottoman conquests for centuries. They took Constantinople in 1453, ending the Byzantine Empire. They pushed into Hungary, into Austria. They laid siege to Vienna twice. They fought in North Africa, the Middle East, everywhere the Ottomans expanded. Janissaries led the way. Their white felt hats became symbols of terror. When defenders saw those hats approaching, they knew the fight was about to get serious. But the system had a flaw. The Janissaries knew they were essential. They knew the Sultan needed them, and that knowledge gave them power. By the 16th century, the Janissaries weren't just soldiers. They were a political force. If they didn't like a decision, they rioted. If they wanted a new sultan, they made one. If they disapproved of a vizier, that vizier died. The corps that was supposed to be perfectly loyal became kingmakers. The Janissaries would overturn their soup cauldrons in the barracks courtyard. That was the signal. The cauldron represented their communal life. Overturning it meant rebellion. When the soup cauldrons went over, everyone in Constantinople knew the Janissaries were angry and blood was coming. Sultans would scramble to appease them. Bonuses, promises, sometimes executions of whoever the Janissaries blamed for their grievances. This happened repeatedly. The Janissaries deposed sultans, strangled viziers, demanded higher pay, forced policy changes. The slave soldiers, who were supposed to have no will except the Sultan's will, became the most powerful political faction in the empire. The system designed to create perfect obedience had created a monster. Part of the problem was that the original rules broke down. Janissaries started marrying despite the prohibition. They had children, and those children, born into Janissary families, expected to become Janissaries themselves. The corps became hereditary. The meritocracy collapsed. You didn't need to be the strongest or smartest anymore. You just needed to be born into a Janissary family. The quality declined. The discipline eroded. New Janissaries hadn't been through the brutal training, hadn't been stripped of everything and rebuilt. They were just sons of soldiers, expecting privilege without earning it. The corps swelled with men who were Janissaries in name only. They collected salaries. They enjoyed privileges. But they couldn't fight like their predecessors. By the 17th century, the Janissaries were more of a liability than an asset. They still wielded political power, but militarily they were obsolete. European armies had modernized, developed new tactics, better firearms, coordinated infantry and artillery. The Janissaries, stuck in their traditions, refused to adapt. They saw modernization as a threat to their status. Sultans tried to reform them, tried to introduce new training, New weapons, new tactics. The Janissaries resisted violently. They'd riot, kill the reformers, overthrow sultans who pushed too hard. The core that had once been the empire's greatest strength was now strangling it. The Ottomans were losing wars because their elite troops refused to evolve. The Janissaries also became an economic burden. There were too many of them. Over 100,000 men collecting salaries. Many didn't fight anymore. They ran businesses in Constantinople. They operated shops. They became a privileged class living off the state while contributing nothing. The treasury bled money, keeping them fed and paid, while they did everything except what they were created to do, win wars. And they were brutal in maintaining their power. If someone challenged them, they'd burn down neighborhoods. They'd loot. They'd kill. Constantinople lived in fear of Janissary riots. The population hated them, but nobody could stop them. They had weapons, training, organization. They could overthrow the government, if pushed too far, and everyone knew it. Sultan Mahmud II finally decided enough was enough. By 1826, the Janissaries were a cancer. The empire was crumbling, losing territory, losing wars. And the Janissaries, the force that was supposed to protect the empire, were the main obstacle to reform. Mahmud started quietly building a new army, a modern force trained in European tactics. He knew he could only move against the Janissaries if he had a replacement ready. When he announced reforms to the Janissary Corps, they reacted predictably. They rioted, overturned their cauldrons, marched on the palace. But this time Mahmud was ready. He had his new troops. He had artillery, and he had a population that despised the Janissaries and would support their destruction. Mahmud gave the order. The new army surrounded the Janissary barracks. Artillery was positioned, and then they opened fire. Cannonballs tore through the barracks. The buildings caught fire. Janissaries trying to escape were shot down. Thousands died in hours. The survivors were hunted through the streets, executed, exiled. The Janissary corpse was annihilated in a single day. The Ottomans called it the Auspicious Incident, a clean bureaucratic name for a massacre. Over 4,000 Janissaries were killed outright. Thousands more were arrested and executed later. Anyone associated with the Corps was purged. Their families lost their privileges. Their property was confiscated. The empire erased them as thoroughly as the Janissaries had once erased the identities of stolen Christian boys. And just like that, 3 centuries of Janissary history ended. The slave soldiers who'd conquered empires, who'd terrified Europe, who'd become so powerful they could make and break sultans. They were gone, burned alive in their barracks, shot in the streets. The institution that had defined Ottoman military power was obliterated because it refused to change. There's a dark irony in that. The Janissaries were created through violence, stolen children traumatized and molded into killers. And they ended in violence, massacred by the empire they'd served. The system that stripped boys of their identities and turned them into weapons eventually turned those weapons on itself. And when the empire no longer needed them, it destroyed them without hesitation. What's disturbing isn't just the violence, it's the efficiency. The Ottomans kidnapped children for centuries, and nobody stopped them. Christian families watched their sons taken and couldn't resist. The boys were processed through a system designed to erase who they were and replace it with absolute loyalty. And it worked. For generations, it worked brilliantly. Those boys didn't rebel. They didn't run home. They became exactly what the empire wanted. They fought. They killed. They conquered. Some rose to high positions, became generals, governors, wealthy and powerful. But they started as traumatized children stolen from their families and brainwashed into forgetting where they came from. The devshirme system reveals something uncomfortable about human nature. You can take a child, any child, and turn them into almost anything if you control their environment completely. The Janissaries weren't born warriors. They were made. Through isolation, indoctrination, training, trauma. The Ottomans understood that identity is fragile, malleable, and they weaponized that understanding. And for a while the system seemed perfect. The Janissaries had no divided loyalties because they had nothing except the core. They couldn't plot with nobles because they weren't nobles. They couldn't scheme with religious leaders because they were converts. They existed outside the normal power structures which made them controllable, or so the sultans thought. But the system's perfection was its flaw. The Janissaries' isolation made them loyal to each other, not necessarily to the sultan. They were a family, a brotherhood, and when that brotherhood decided something, it acted as one. The unity that made them effective in battle made them terrifying in politics. You can't negotiate with a unified force that has nothing to lose except their collective status. The Ottomans created a weapon they eventually couldn't control. The Janissaries were too effective, too unified, too aware of their own importance. They became a state within a state, an army that could veto imperial policy, that could demand tribute, that could kill with impunity. The slave soldiers became masters. There's also the question of the boys who weren't selected, the ones who watched their brothers or neighbors taken and wondered why they were spared, or maybe felt guilty they were spared. The ones who grew up knowing the empire could come back any time and take them too. That psychological weight, the randomness of it, the helplessness, it shaped entire communities. Some families tried to hide their sons, made them look weak or sick during inspections, bribed officials, fled to remote areas, but most couldn't. Most just complied because resistance was death. And that compliance, that acceptance of child conscription as normal, that's its own kind of horror. The system normalized child theft, made it bureaucratic, gave it a schedule and procedures and everything else that makes atrocity feel routine. The boys who were taken and survived the training probably experienced something like Stockholm Syndrome. The empire destroyed their old lives but gave them new ones, purpose, power, belonging. For a traumatized child, that's seductive. You learn to love the thing that hurt you because it's all you have. The Janissaries' loyalty wasn't just beaten into them. It was psychologically engineered. And the system lasted for centuries because it solved a real problem. Sultans did face constant threats from family, from nobles, from ambitious generals. The Janissaries, with no connections and no inheritance, really were more trustworthy than traditional forces. The cruelty of the system was also its effectiveness. That's what makes it disturbing. It wasn't cruel for cruelty's sake. It was cruel because cruelty worked. The Ottomans weren't uniquely evil. Other empires enslaved people, conscripted soldiers, used brutal training methods. But the devshirme system's combination of child conscription, religious conversion, and lifelong military service was unusual. It was systematic, organized, refined over generations. The Ottomans turned child theft into a science. When the system finally ended, it wasn't because of moral objections. It was because it stopped working. The Janissaries became a problem, so they were eliminated. The empire didn't apologize, didn't acknowledge the centuries of stolen children. It just moved on, built a new army, kept expanding, kept conquering. The machinery of empire doesn't stop for conscience. The Janissaries are remembered now mostly as exotic historical curiosities. Elite soldiers, colorful uniforms, interesting military tactics. The human cost gets minimized. The trauma of the conscripted boys, the grief of their families, the violence of their indoctrination. That part is less interesting to historians focused on battles and politics. But that's the real story. The Janissaries were children first, children who were taken, who cried for parents who couldn't save them, who forgot their names and their language, and their religion because the empire required it, who became killers because they had no other option, who built lives within the core, because the empire made sure they had nowhere else to go. Some of them probably convinced themselves they were lucky. They had power, wealth, respect. They were Janissaries, the elite, better than being a peasant in some forgotten village. Maybe that's true. Maybe some really were better off. Or maybe that's just what you tell yourself when you can't go home and you can't admit that your entire life is built on trauma. The Ottoman Empire doesn't exist anymore. The Janissaries are gone. The barracks where they lived are ruins or museums. The system that created them is a historical footnote. But the logic behind it, the understanding that you can take people young enough, isolate them completely, and remake them into whatever you need, that hasn't disappeared. Every military force understands this to some degree. Basic training breaks you down and builds you back up, not to the extent the Ottomans did. Not with the same cruelty, but the principle is the same. Control environment, control identity, control loyalty. The Janissaries were just the most extreme, most successful version of an idea that militaries still use. The uncomfortable truth is that the devshirme system worked for 300 years. It provided the Ottoman Empire with loyal, effective soldiers who conquered territories and terrified enemies. The cost was borne by Christian families who lost their sons and by the boys who lost themselves. But empires don't calculate cost that way. They calculate in territory gained. Wars won, power accumulated, and when the Janissaries finally fell, when they were massacred in their barracks and erased from the empire they'd served, nobody mourned them. The population of Constantinople celebrated. The empire moved on. The Janissaries had become the villains of their own story, from stolen children to elite warriors, to oppressive parasites to corpses. That's the arc. There's no justice in that story. No redemption. Just a system that created monsters, used them until they became inconvenient, then destroyed them. The boys who were taken never got to go home. The families who lost them never got closure. The Janissaries who died in 1826 died defending an institution that had built itself on their trauma. Maybe that's the lesson. That institutions built on violence eventually turn that violence inward. That slave soldiers, no matter how elite, are still slaves. That the empire that steals children will eventually devour its own. Or maybe there's no lesson. Maybe it's just what happened. And what happened was that for 3 centuries, the Ottoman Empire stole Christian boys, erased their identities, and turned them into the most feared fighting force in the world, until they weren't useful anymore. Then they were deleted just as thoroughly as those boys' original identities had been. The Janissaries are gone, but the children they once were are gone too, forgotten, erased by a system that needed soldiers more than it, needed to preserve the humanity of the boys it conscripted. That's the real story. Not the battles or the tactics or the colorful uniforms, but the theft, the trauma, the systematic destruction of identity in service of empire. That's what the Janissaries actually were.